I've never had a substance addiction, but I certainly have had my own trauma. I've written books on healing from trauma, and I became interested in Father Ed Dowling, the subject of my book, Father Ed, the story of Bill W.'s spiritual sponsor, because I was really struck that here was a Jesuit who was not an alcoholic himself, yet he felt so drawn to help people with alcohol addiction and with other addictions at a time when Catholic priests actually were not permitted to minister to non-Catholics. So as you'll hear, as I'll share in this presentation, Father Ed, well, actually, I'll begin by moving on to the first slide with some facts about his life. Born in 1898, died in 1960. Those of you who know some recent Catholic history will know that the Second Vatican Council, which opened up the church's outreach in many ways, wasn't until 1962. And it wasn't until the Second Vatican Council that Catholic priests, as well as the Catholic laity and all the faithful, were told, yes, go out to non-Catholics, dialogue with them, meet them on mutual grounds of whatever is good, whatever is true, whatever is beautiful. So in Father Ed's time, it was much different. The Code of Canon Law at that time called non-Catholic Christians heretics, and non-Christians were pagans. And priests had to receive special permission before doing any kind of ministry with them. Father Ed, on his own, kind of a bit rogue. He was always obedient, but he really kind of on his own sought out Bill Wilson, who was not Catholic. And then once he became friends with Bill Wilson, the co-founder of AA, then he went to his superior and said, well, I have now this outreach to alcoholics. Can I continue it? And thanks be to God, his Jesuit superior back in, by then it was 1942, said, yes, you may. And so for the rest of Father Ed's life, he had a tremendous outreach to where he touched thousands of lives of not only alcoholics, but anyone with a problem. In this presentation, I'm keeping an eye on the time for about the next 15, 20 minutes or so. I'll give you a brief overview of Father Ed's life and ministry with a special focus on how he understood the 12 steps of AA within the ambit of the Ignatian Jesuit spirituality in which he was formed. So as you can see on this slide, he was from St. Louis and lived there pretty much all his life. Very proud Irish American. So he didn't initially think he was called to be a Jesuit. He thought he was going to be a professional baseball player. And you see him in this slide, front and center. He was the manager of his baseball team at a Jesuit college, no longer exists, in Kansas, St. Mary's College. And you can see he's got that kind of young James Dean look, rugged, athletic. He after a couple years in college, he was trying out for pro baseball teams, was told he wasn't ready. He decided to become a journalist, and he worked for a year in journalism, but he couldn't get it out of his head that he might be called to a Jesuit vocation. He had gone to a Jesuit high school as well as a Jesuit college. So he decided that he was going to enter the Jesuit novitiate in outside St. Louis, in Florissant, Missouri, and he was going to go into it for 2 weeks just to show that he had tried it and it wasn't for him. So he didn't even bring a trunk when he went into the novitiate, because he figured he wasn't going to be there long enough to need anything. But once he was there and they put the cassock on him, he started to, I left out the novitiate photo. Well, I'll tell you, he started to get this uneasy feeling that perhaps this was what he was actually called to do and be. And that made him uncomfortable because he felt that he enjoyed life too much to be a drab Jesuit. At that time, Jesuit life was it looked different than it does today. In many ways, it was still the same. There was the wonderful Ignatian spirituality, the spiritual exercises. There was the preaching and teaching and hearing confessions and so on. But what there wasn't was a whole lot of engagement with the outside world and with ordinary people. And Father Ed, as a journalist, had enjoyed being very engaged with the world, very engaged with people. And also, Jesuit life was much more disciplined back then in terms of just when they would wake up in the morning and what they would do at different times of day, especially in the novitiate, more so than in any other area of Jesuit life. It was like a boot camp where there was a series of dozens of bells that went off at different times of the day, where it was like, ding, wake up, ding, wash, ding, and read Imitation of Christ, ding, do manual labor, ding, 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 all through the day. And the bells alone drove young Edward Dowling mad. He was known to his friends as Puggy Dowling, actually, because of his pug nose. So Puggy Dowling, SJ, who loved to sleep late, thought, this isn't for me, get me out of here. But he couldn't leave because he felt that if he left, he would be going against the will of God. So then he faced a crisis as a young Jesuit novice. How could God be calling him to something that was impossible for him? Was God calling him to be unhappy all his life as a drab religious? And as he tried to find a way to reconcile himself to his Jesuit vocation, the one thing that really helped him was the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius Loyola. I'll go to this next slide, which shows him before his ordination, but still while he was in his Jesuit formation. By this point, he's made his first vows. So every Jesuit in their first year of the 2-year novitiate, they make the 30-day spiritual exercises. These exercises are a series of meditations through which the Jesuit novice and anyone making the exercise, because it's not only Jesuits who make them, who make the exercises, but in the 30-day version, young Puggy Dowling would have had the experience of meditating on different episodes in the life of Jesus and the life of the apostles and the early church and Mary, meditating upon these episodes and seeing where God was calling him to grow through imitating the life of Christ and the apostles and Mary. And young Puggy Dowling gained so much from these exercises that in his second year of the novitiate, he asked to make them again. He begged his novice master to let him make these exercises again. And by then, the Jesuits had been around for almost 400 years, and nobody in the history of the Jesuits had ever done the spiritual exercises twice during the novitiate. A 30-day time is a pretty long time to take out of a second year in the novitiate. But Puggy was in such a crisis emotionally that his novice master amazingly, miraculously let him make them a second time. And after he made these exercises a second time, he still was not sure if that was where God was calling him. But finally, at the very last minute that he had to decide whether he was going to make his first vows, at the end of the 2-year novitiate, he decided that he would make the first vows, hoping that God would give him the grace to live this vocation. And because he made this last minute decision, when he took his first vows, he chose for his vow saint, kind of like we have a baptismal saint, confirmation saint, Jesuits can choose a vow saint. He chose Saint Dismas. Does anyone here know who Dismas was? Who was Saint Dismas? Oh, a patron saint of mental health. He could be, definitely. But do you know like what Saint Dismas did? Anyone know? So Saint Dismas was the good thief. And he was the thief who stole heaven at the last minute. He was the thief on the cross next to Jesus who said, "Remember me, Lord, when you come into your kingdom." So young Puggy Dowling, S.J., became Edward Dismas Dowling, S.J. So from the very beginning of his vowed Jesuit life, he was identifying with the least in society. And because of the way that the spiritual exercises helped really save him from this crisis of faith, and after he made his first vows, he was out of that crisis. He felt great consolation. He chose to write his master's thesis on the spiritual exercises as a means of training the will. He envisioned, this is in 1925 when this photo was taken, he envisioned that the spiritual exercises could be extended to everybody, not just Jesuits, not just Catholics, that they contained principles and steps in them that could be used to help people to get rid of bad habits and develop healthy habits. 1925. Alcoholics Anonymous didn't begin until Dr. Bob took his last drink in June 1935. So you picture 1925, Edward Dowling, S.J., writes on the final page of his master's thesis, note, at the advice of the Secretary of the Board of Graduate Studies, I shall stop here and conclude with an outline of what was to have followed. Because basically he was writing a doctoral dissertation in his head. And he was told, no, you have to stop here because you have to finish your master's thesis within a reasonable period of time for your Jesuit formation. And so he wrote that in the final part of his thesis, he was going to show the psychological steps in the exercises. Steps. I love that. That blew my mind reading that. As well as to indicate evidence of St. Ignatius having used the findings of psychology. At the time he wrote that, psychology was, I'm not exaggerating here. I know people tend to exaggerate about the bad old days before the council. I actually like a lot of stuff before the council. But in this case, before the council, psychology was a dirty word in Jesuit circles. It sounds shocking now because you meet Jesuit psychologists, it's perfectly normal, and you have this great psychology program here at a Jesuit university. But psychology back in 1925 in the American Catholic world was identified with Freud and with what was called materialism, a materialistic philosophy that reduced the human person to physical matter and omitted the soul. And because that was what the Catholic Church in America understood psychology to be. When Puggy Dowling was doing his master's thesis, he actually had one of his advisors told him to cross out every time, every place that the word psychology appears, and put the word philosophy. So that was his dream. He wasn't able to fulfill it at that time. He asked to continue for a doctorate and to do a doctorate on the psychology of the spiritual exercises. Nope. So he became the priest for people with problems. And he had his office at the Queen's Work in St. Louis, which was a Jesuit publishing apostolate, part of the Sodality of Our Lady, what's now become Christian Life communities. And people from all walks of life used to line up outside his door, asking for help with their practical problems. And one person who was referred to him was someone he knew from the journalism world who had become a terrible drunk and was about to get fired. I've been given permission by this person's granddaughter to breach his anonymity. Normally, I wouldn't give the name of the full name of someone in AA, but I have permission to say that this was a reporter then for the Chicago Daily News, Edwin A. Leahy, who went on to be, if I recall correctly, I think a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter. Certainly he became the top Washington, D.C. reporter of his time. But back in 1940, January, the year this photo was taken, Edwin Leahy was about to get fired from his job in Chicago. What Father Ed did at that time in January 1940, AA had not yet come to St. Louis. Father Ed didn't know about AA. He just kind of worked his pastoral magic, bringing Leahy and Leahy's wife, who had become estranged from him due to his drinking. He brought them back together in that office that you see in that photo, and he asked Leahy to promise to stop drinking. So Leahy promised to stop drinking, and so Father Ed sent the Leahys back to St. Louis, not to St. Louis, he sent them back to Chicago from St. Louis to repair their marriage. And then a month later, Father Ed went back to Chicago to check up on the Leahys, and he was quite pleased to find that Leahy was no longer had continued to stay off alcohol, but he was a little concerned to find that Leahy was now hanging out with his former drinking buddies in a group called Alcoholics Anonymous. And so Leahy invited Father Ed to come to this AA meeting. And when Father Ed came and heard the alcoholics begin to tell their stories, he had an experience that he would later compare to the feeling of an influx, a flood of grace like he received at his priestly ordination, where he felt that he was in the presence of the Holy Spirit. It was like being in the catacombs with the early Christians, where he heard these alcoholics tell their stories, and he felt the Spirit in that room, and he felt that this was what he had to do. And he never looked back. He took a copy of the Big Book, which was then only a year old. That's the book that was written by Bill Wilson, co-founder of AA with Dr. Bob, and written with the input of the first 100 members of AA. Father Ed took this book back with him to St. Louis, started to study it, immediately began to plan to start a chapter of AA in St. Louis. He wrote to the home office of AA to inquire about starting a new chapter, did all of this very quickly. And a fellow Jesuit who was an alcoholic pointed out to him connections between the spiritual exercises and the 12 steps. And that really fascinated Father Ed. So then Father Ed just had to meet Bill Wilson. Father Ed imagined that Bill Wilson had to be this great master of Ignatian spirituality to come up with these steps that were so reminiscent of the spiritual exercises. Well, I have a couple of slides to quickly go through. I just wanted to show you. This is around the time that Father Ed was helping to start the first chapter of AA in St. Louis. He brought down Leahy and John T. of the Chicago AA to kind of shepherd the first AA chapter in St. Louis. So you see Leahy looking very dapper, very much a reporter in his tweeds, and you can see what I'm sure is a big pack of cigarettes in his pocket. And you see John T. There, and you see Leahy looking quite joyful. He wasn't joyful before then. You know, if he was smiling, you know, in the years before then, it was as a drunk. But here he's just maybe, I guess this is probably right when the AA group was started in St. Louis. You know, he was maybe 9 months sober at that point, and really joyful and excited about sobriety, about spreading the message. So on this next slide, you've seen that before. I think this is actually it's dated August 1944. Edward signed it saying, "Lois," that's Bill's wife, "I do wish you were here with us." So this is about 4 years after Father Ed first met Bill. Because of time, I'll omit speaking about their first meeting, which is described in Father Ed, because I want to get to the connections between the spiritual exercises and the 12 steps. But I will tell you that that when Father Ed encountered Bill at the AA clubhouse in New York City in November 1940, when Bill was in a bad mood at that time. Bill would later say he was on a dry drunk, meaning that he wasn't drinking, but he was certainly thinking in the kind of limited ways, self-centered ways that he had been when he was drinking. Father Ed, whom Bill didn't know at all at that point, just sat himself down next to Bill and said, "I'm very interested in the connections between your 12 steps and the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius Loyola." And Bill said, "Never heard of him." And Father Ed laughed, and that laugh broke the ice between them and started a 20-year friendship where Bill came to call Father Ed his spiritual sponsor. In AA, a sponsor is someone who's worked the steps, who helps another person work the steps, and helps their sponsee work the steps. Father Ed, was a spiritual sponsor in that he hadn't worked the steps himself as an alcoholic, but he helped Bill really get deeper into the spirituality behind the steps. And that's what I want to talk with you about now. So to talk about how Father Ed understood the 12 steps in relation to the spiritual exercises, I'm using this chart developed by a Canadian Jesuit. This is on the back of your handout. Probably should have put it on the front of the handout. But Canadian Jesuit Jean-Marc Laporte put this together, connecting the 4 weeks of the spiritual exercises with the 3 stages of the spiritual life. So Father Ed was familiar very much with the 4 weeks of the spiritual exercises, and he was also familiar with the classical understanding of the 3 stages of the spiritual life. So this goes back to medieval times, the 3 stages of the spiritual life. So these predate Ignatius. Ignatius would have been very familiar with this as he was writing his, I shouldn't say very familiar, but he certainly had some familiarity with these as he was writing his spiritual exercises. The 3 stages are the purgative stage, illuminative stage, and the unitive stage. So the purgative stage of the spiritual life, you see in like the bottom left, it says, that's the stage of conversion to Christ, where we repent for sins committed, and we develop this desire to make up for the good that we haven't done. So it's that real sense of contrition and wanting to make amends. The illuminative stage of the spiritual life is in really walking with Christ, learning from Jesus Christ, seeking to imitate him. So that's the stage where we go from the negative side of the spiritual life, not negative in terms of bad, but in terms of wanting to get rid of whatever's preventing me from walking with Christ, get rid of my sins, get rid of any baggage that I have from sins that I've committed against others where I need to make amends. As we've gotten rid of those things, then we want to put good things into ourselves. We want to take that kind of vacuum that's been created by getting rid of the bad stuff and infuse it with the grace that we need to grow in virtue. So that's the experience of walking with Christ, following him, increasing in perfection, persevering in perfection. And then finally, there's the unitive stage of the spiritual life, which you see in the lower right-hand corner there. There's the dying to self, recognizing that as St. Paul says your life is hidden with Christ. And then there's also the rising of the self, being sent out in service. So in this chart, you see the different weeks of the spiritual exercises, along with the traditional understanding of the purpose of this week, each week. I won't go into that too much detail for reasons of time. But one thing you can see is that the weeks don't conform perfectly to the different stages of the spiritual life. So the first week does conform perfectly in terms of its part of the purgative stage of the spiritual life. But then the second and third week, there's still like a bit of the purgative, and then in the second week, the illuminative comes in, and then in the third week, you have the illuminative stage, but the unitive stage begins to come in. And then the fourth week, ideally, is purely unitive. Now, in the fourth, well, I'll get into a bit more about that. But first, I want to just go over very briefly the 12 steps to say that in Father Ed's understanding, Father Ed saw the first 3 steps as being connected to the principle and foundation of the spiritual exercises, which are part of the very first week. So these first 3 steps are the surrender, the recognizing God's lordship and God as creator, and surrendering ourselves to God. And that's connected with the principle and foundation of the spiritual exercises, which talks about how we are to see ourselves in God's eyes, as God having created us and created us for a purpose, and that the things of this life are useful in as much as they bring us to our purpose of loving and serving God, and being loving and serving God in this life, and being united with Him, for forever, with a union that becomes fulfilled in the next life. So those first 3 steps definitely would belong in that first week, which is also the purgative stage. These next steps, 4 through 9, also belong in the purgative stage of the spiritual life. This just as the purgative stage sort of goes from the first week, begins to go into the second week as well. Even as we're growing in the graces of the second week of the exercises, we are still conscious of having sinned and needing God's grace to bring us to the point where we are no longer persisting in sin, but are now devoting ourselves to growing in virtue, while being conscious that we always have original sin that's not washed away with baptism, and we always need to be aware of the importance of confessing our sins. So Father Ed, when speaking about the spiritual exercises and the 12 steps, he saw the 10th step, continue to take personal inventory, and when we were wrong, promptly admitted it. He connected that with the examine of the spiritual exercises, examine, EXAMEN, which is something that one is to do on a daily basis throughout making the spiritual exercises, to examine where one is responding to God on a daily basis, where God is calling to me, where God is meeting me in the events of my daily life, and where I have responded to God and where I've failed to respond to God. Father Ed saw that in the 10th step. Now, in the 11th and 12th steps, Father Ed saw a limited parallel to the illuminative stage and the unitive stage of the spiritual life, and the third and fourth weeks of the exercises. Especially, with this idea of seeking through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God, as we understood him, and Father Ed was very conscious of the importance of this continually being in a state of recognizing one's dependence upon God and seeking God's grace, and the evangelical nature of carrying this message. So this story, which I've put on the front page of your handout, is it shows not only what the spiritual exercises meant for Father Ed, but it also shows simultaneously what his ministry meant for him, his ministry to alcoholics. And this is the last slide, and this is what I'm going to leave you with before going on to questions. I apologize, I've made this a bit longer than I had intended to, but I'm used to giving 45-minute talks because Father Ed's story is so rich. So this is from an article that Father Ed wrote in Grapevine magazine in July of you can see it here, 1955, where he describes how an AA member told him that he had been skeptical about AA until he realized that the 12 steps were the systematic expression of an old Jesuit prayer he had learned. Now, this prayer is the prayer that is the kind of crown of the spiritual exercises. This is the prayer that really symbolizes the unitive way of the spiritual life, that state in the spiritual life where we want nothing more than to be united with God, and where we've detached ourselves as much as is humanly possible in this life from the baggage that weighs us down. Again, always conscious that we have to be vigilant not to fall, but still where we have a certain amount of confidence in God's grace that accompanies us at all times and protects us. And this prayer, this is a very kind of archaic version of it. There are more modern versions of the Sushi Pay that you can find online, but it's: take, Lord, and receive all my liberty, my memory, my intellect, and all my will, all that I have and possess. Thou gavest it to me, to thee, Lord, I return it. All is thine, dispose of it according to thy will. Give me thy love and grace, for this is enough for me. And Father Ed describes how he told his AA friend that he was afraid of this prayer. He was afraid that if he made that offering to God at 8 o'clock in the morning, he would have taken it back by 10 o'clock. And his friend replied to him, how do you know you'll be alive by 10 o'clock? How do you know but that God may give you even greater help after making that offering? That's the way that AA has taught me to look at it. And Father Ed wrote that since then, I have not been afraid of that prayer. This AA member had given me an understanding of that old Jesuit prayer, which I had not got in my 30 Jesuit years. So this is, in a nutshell, what Father Ed received from his ministry to AAs. He said that in AAs, in his ministry to AA, he had seen miracles walk. He expected miracles to walk. He had come to gain a great confidence in God's grace to accompany him and each AA at every point in their journey through the experience of watching people live the 12 steps and accompanying them. And I have to say, it's been such a blessing for me as a non-alcoholic to have even a taste of that experience that Father Ed had in encountering AAs through having written AAs. I mean, through having written Father Ed. I didn't write AA, Bill W. wrote AA. You can see I'm kind of in a haze here. Through having written Father Ed, it's been an amazing experience to have a taste of that grace that he received in ministering to AAs, and I'm so grateful. So thank you. You've been wonderful. Thank you for bearing with me with this. Please, feel free to get up and start enjoying the hot food. But I would be delighted to begin answering questions. Some of the questions that Dr. Tierney has, and then he's got a microphone for questions from the audience. And if you don't wish to be on mic in the recording, then you can say your question to Paul, to Dr. Tierney, and he can repeat the question into the microphone. So thank you and God bless you.